Hey y'all! Well, we're back to the R8. Thought we were done, but found one more issue. I was doing another one of these for a customer who mailed it to me and found a problem with the volume control wiring. When I was done, he sent it to me because it has a hum. And I know some of you out there said, mine's dead silent. I'm not going to argue with people, but I don't see how it's possible the way these things are wired that one could be dead silent unless you have some super inefficient speakers. Anyway, especially when it was on the preamp setting, it had some hiss and hum. Just wasn't happy 100% with the way it turned out. So I dug into the wiring between the volume control board and the relay board in the back of the amp and found some issues. So we're fixing to dig into that and explore really lowering the noise floor of this amp, which at the end of the day really improved the sound of it as well. So let's get busy. Okay, so we're going to dig into this wiring to the volume control to this relay board up here where the RCA jacks are all connected. And on the other amp I worked on, I guess thought this was good enough, and I'd fixed so many other things, I just kind of stopped there. But somebody on the stereo.net platform found some issues with the way the wiring was done between this point on the volume control and over here on this side where this relay board's connected. And further investigation, yeah, they did not do this the way they should have. So first we cut all these wire ties, and I'm going to try to pull that relay cable out of the way, because this is the cable that goes up here to the front board that switches between the different input signals used in these relays. Now, one of the things they did that I do like, if you follow the tracing on this board, they've got a 1K resistor between each positive terminal on the RCA jack to the relay. They also have, when the relay is turned off, that it's grounding all the other input jacks through that 1K resistor to the signal ground, so that only the relay that's energized allows the positive signal to go through these shielded wires to the volume control, which is great, because if you've got signals playing on these other jacks and you're like pulling off this one and there happens to be signal or noise on one of these other ones, it's shunted to ground through the relay. So that was all wired well. And that's why they have this ground wire. Let me try to zoom in here on this end of the board. So if you look right here, you see there's a ground wire that goes from the board over to this ground bus on these RCA jacks. And I want to touch on this real quick. The other issue I have is these wires are way too long. There's no reason these things should be looped up like with that much excess wire when you're talking about an unshielded signal wire. So we're going to shorten all these up and get the signal path as short as we can between this board and these jacks. But the main issue we have here is the way they've grounded this shielded cable and then added a second ground. So you've got these wires here, which are shielded wires, and it's kind of hard to see maybe, but the shields, these are single conductor shielded wires, and they have the center connector is the signal positive that's connected left and right on the board. Then they tie the two shields together and bring them down to the board as a ground. So the ground path for the signal is going through the shield of the shielded wire, which is kind of common on lower end products. So then they bring it to this ground point here, which is tying this negative that is the shield for these wires to this point. Also grounds the relays that aren't being used, and then this ground wire comes over here to the ground bus. And all of that makes sense. But then they've added this, which is a second ground wire that goes from the bus here back over to the volume control. And then as you can see, here's where they have the two shields tied together on this end of it that they pull down here to this ground point. Now on the other side, they have the shields of the two wires going over to the grids of the input tubes grounded here, and then they have this ground wire that goes over to the ground bus and then to our star ground point. And I don't have too much of an issue with the way they've wired that. Is it like 100% ideal in how I would wire the amp if I was doing it point to point? No, it isn't. But I don't see it as being an issue because on the grid end, the shield is open. So any noise that gets in these wires that are going over to the grids of the tubes, it gets shunted through this ground wire that goes over to the star ground point. And that's what the shielding is supposed to do. Now on these wires, I'm not a huge fan of using the return ground signal to the RCA jacks through the shield of the wire, but it will work. But what won't work is adding another ground that's looping around the other ground. And that's basically the definition of a ground loop, is you've got two ground paths that are parallel to each other in a loop. So what I'm going to try first is disconnecting this big ground lead here at the volume control, and then also over here where this wire connects up to this ground bus. It's redundant. It doesn't need to be there. So after removing this, I'm going to hook the amp back up and see if the last little bit of noise that I'm hearing in the, especially the preamp jacks, goes away, getting rid of this ground loop. And if it does, then I'll come back and shorten these wires up, because I feel like that if I shorten these up now, right now there's enough slack where I can flip this board upside down if I need to replace these shielded wires with a two conductor style. And let me show you real quick what I'm talking about on the shielding types. Okay, here's a picture of what I call basic shielding, where you have the grounded end at the tube on the shield, then you ground the second shielded wire to the negative on the volume control, and the ends of both shielded wires is open, and you use a two conductor shielded wire to bring the signal into the amplifier. Now, after building a few amps, I've started doing this better design. In this design, I connect the two shields together and pull them all the way back to the tube ground, and the two conductor wire is shielded all the way to the RCA jack, passed through the volume control, and any extraneous noise that the shield picks up then gets grounded back to the point of origin ground. Okay, here's the R8 as it's wired. And as you can see, the shielded wire that is going to the tube grids is grounded at the volume control. And the other end is open because we just need the signal there, because the other signal return is being brought through from the volume control ground to the front end ground bus wire. And like I said, That's not ideal, but I don't think that's really a problem. Where the problem is, if you look at the wiring from the RCA jack to the volume control, you can see that they're using the shield as one ground, and then they've added another ground wire. And so you can easily draw a loop with the two grounds where they are separate ground paths going to the same point. And you never want that. And I'm not sure why they even did that. And then finally, this is what I would call an optimal rewiring of the volume control to the RCA jack board, where we use a 2-conductor shielded wire. The signal path is straight through from the RCA jack to the volume control, and then the shield for that wire is grounded at the volume control, and the other end of the shield's open. So back to this amp here I'm working on. I'm going to disconnect this ground wire, because this would be a pretty simple mod. If removing this at both ends and just getting rid of this extra fat ground wire and letting the RCA jacks ground through the shield of these shielded wires gets the amp quieter, that might be like an easy, simple mod to do without rewiring the whole front end and having to go buy a bunch of new shielded wires, etc. So let me do that real quick and then give it a listen to, and I'll report back what I find. Okay, so I experimented with some changes, and it was an improvement, and I think we're on the right track, but I'm still not real happy 100% with the way this has turned out. I first had this connected to here, or left it where it was from the factory, had this ground point hooked over to the bus, and then I'd removed this wire that went around, the extra double ground. And it cleaned up the signal, but I was still getting some kind of weird interference, possibly from these relays. The coils in those relays are getting into the signal, and obviously that's not ideal. And so I then connected the ground. I removed it from here and hooked the signal ground straight up to this bus. And it's almost silent now. But there is a little bit of weird noise still coming in. And I still think the little bit that I'm hearing is getting picked up by the shielded wire using the shield as the signal ground. So I am going to go ahead and replace these shielded wires with some 2-conductor ones that are grounded on the volume control end. I'm going to hook the signal ground straight up to this bus, and then I'm going to run a ground wire. Let me zoom out here and show you how I'm going to do this. So we're going to take this ground here on this board that's shunting the unused signals to ground up, around, and then over to this main ground point right here, so that all those signals that are unused are grounded over here to our main input tube ground point, and they're not anywhere in the signal path ground for the used RCA jack. And I think that's going to clean everything up. So let me show you what this wire looks like that I'm going to be using. And the wire I'm going to be using looks like this. It's got 2 signal wires and then the shield. And on the volume control end, we're going to be tying this white ground wire to the shield. And then on the other end, where the bus is, we're going to be just connecting this to the bus and then this to the board for the left and right channels. And then, like I said, we're going to be grounding the board separately from the signal ground. So let me get this wired up, and then I can show you what all this looks like when I'm finished. Okay guys, we got this all wired up, and let me show you what I did here. Here we have our 2-conductor shielded wires, and as you can see, one of the red or positive wires goes to the left and right on the board, and then we have both of the ground white wires over here on the bus bar that goes across the negative jacks on the RCA. And note these RCA jacks are insulated from the chassis. Then I shortened up these wires that go from the circuit board over to the positive signal wire of each of the RCA jacks, so there's less exposed unshielded wire. And so you understand what's going on here. I changed my mind about how to run this board ground. So what's going on is each of these signal wires come to the board. They go through a 1K relay, and then they go to the center of a DP-DT relay. So the switch has two options. It can either switch on, which sends the signal to these left and right terminals that go to the shielded wires that go up to the volume control. Okay, the relays that are off, both of these wires through these resistors gets tied to this point right here. And the idea is not to shunt this to ground, but it's to short the jack out across that relay. And the reason it does that, if there's a signal on these other jacks that are off, it shorts them from here to this bus bar through that resistor, so that it basically kills the signal, and so that it doesn't interfere with the signal that you're wanting to hear, which is the relay that's turned on. So to that end, the more I thought about it, running this over to our input tube ground bar would be the opposite really of what I'm trying to do here. I'm wanting this just to be a short path from here to this ground. And so running this from here to there does what we want it to do. Now, I wanted to run these ground wires for the signal instead of from this board and then through this jumper. I'm going to solder them directly to this bus bar so that the return path for the signal goes straight to this ground side of the RCA jacks and isn't getting mixed up with potentially signal that could be coming through this shunt to short out jumper here that goes between the board and this bus bar as well. So we got this all wired up. Let me show you what the other side looks like now. So on this side we have our two shielded wires that come up, and on this end we have the ground wire and the shield tied together to this point on both channels, and then we have the positive lead from the RCA jack or the relay board going to each side left and right of the volume control. And that way we have it shielded on this end, and that way any noise that gets picked up by the shield will go straight to this ground point here that's hooked over to the input tube ground bus. So the last thing we did, and when I was looking at how to deal with this ground, and as you remember, I said I wasn't real happy about the shield for this being hooked to this ground point, because then any noise that gets picked up by the shield then gets brought to this point, which is the return path for the signal. So what I did is I soldered this to another ground wire and brought it around here to this center ground point, and I'll show you what this looks like schematically. And as you can see, this reverts back to the grounding for the shield that I like, where you ground it at the tube end and not the volume control end. And now we have the other wires going from the volume control up to the RCA jacks also connected in the same way, that they're shielded from the volume control end and they're open at the RCA jack end, and that we're using a pair of wires instead of using the shield as the return path for the RCA jack wiring. And I have to say, guys, this really did make a nice difference. And I wasn't expecting it to end up as quiet as it did, but this amp is truly quiet now. And the other thing that I've discovered is that 6SL7 tube has so much gain that some of the noise I was hearing was from the factory Russian tubes that the amp comes with. And when I put some GE short bottle tubes, like I keep recommending for these amps, put a pair of those in, and it dropped the noise to just, I can almost hear nothing at all. And so we're now at the point where the tubes that you're using in that position in the amplifier are making the noise that you hear. It's got nothing to do with the circuit. Where before, when you'd swap the tubes, they both sounded the same. And listening to the amp, it definitely, to me, helped the clarity, and it just sounds sweeter. So again, this is another mod that you're going to have to dig into, and it wasn't a real hard one to do. Not a lot of expense, just getting some wire and sitting down with your soldering iron with some heat shrink tubing and fabbing up this stuff, and then shortening up these little connectors here so that you don't have exposed wiring that's unshielded any more than necessary. So I think this is a good place to wrap this video up. Well, I think you can see that there was definitely some issues here that was worth diving into this portion of the amp and really kind of finishing up the rewiring of this thing and fixing all the ground issues. I originally didn't really understand how that relay board worked and how the volume control was all wired up. And yes, this will affect you people that are using just the preamp in jacks, because it utilizes this same ground shielded wiring, and the only difference is there's a relay on the volume control board that bypasses the volume control when you hit the preamp button, and and of course energizes those pair of jacks. So it's going to be helpful to anyone that's using this amp. I agree with some posters I saw on stereo.net. I'm not sure why people would really use this super hot input that is the preamp. So if I was going to use a preamp with this amplifier, given it's an integrated, I would use the CD input. I would turn my preamp to probably 3/4-ish volume, and then play some music, and then turn the volume control until it's as loud as you would ever possibly want to listen to the music, and then use the preamp volume control to control the volume. You're probably going to end up with this set on maybe 1/4 volume, which is going to attenuate the gain that this amplifier has so that you're able to use the output of the preamp, and it also will help lower the noise floor. So if you're going to use a preamp, that's what I highly recommend, you setting it up that way. The other thing I noticed at the end of this process, once I got the shielding and the grounding on this volume control sorted out, I was able to hear the difference in these 6SL7 tubes as far as the noise floor. And again, popped up a couple of these GE short bottles in, and the noise floor was definitely lower than it was with the Soviet tubes with like the volume cranked up or the preamp inputs used. And so that's another thing to consider when you're choosing which tube that you roll into this thing, what kind of inherent noise those tubes may have. But again, at listening levels, you're not going to hear that from the position seated at the speakers unless you got some super efficient speakers. So anyway, going to wrap this up. Hopefully this is the last of these R8 videos, but somehow I feel like it probably isn't. We're probably going to be revisiting something else with these in the future, possibly trying to figure out how to rewire the front end to use some different input tubes, possibly capacitor coupling them to simplify this, but who knows? We'll get into that when we get into it. Hope you're enjoying this series. If you're enjoying the channel, please subscribe. Please consider joining my Patreon or making a donation at my website if you've used this information to fix your own amp up. And until the next video, have a nice day.